This unit counter guide is going to show you how to counter the Marine with all three races. We're going to start with Protoss, then do Terran, and finally Zerg. The Marine is one of the most popular units in Starcraft 2, and one thing to keep in mind when you're watching this video is that one of the reasons the Marine is so commonly used despite being countered so easily is that it only costs 50 minerals. So just keep that in mind. You need to not only beat the Marine, but be efficient in beating the Marine if you're going to actually come out ahead. So for the Protoss counters, there's two things I wanted to discuss: early game counters and post-tech counters. So Marine with no stim or combat shields is going to actually easily get beat by a Stalker with a little bit of micro. And you'll just stop and shoot like this. And if your Stalker runs out of health, you can pick off a Marine and then just run around and recover. I mean, obviously I'm trapped here, but on a regular map you'd have plenty of space and you want to get countered. And if the Marine runs, you can chase it down. Stalker's just faster. So that's one counter that you should know about. Another counter is the Oracle. And the Oracle works when there's up to 5 Marines. That's the key. And again, these are non-stim, non-combat shields. With stim and combat shield, it's a different story, but it's good to know for early game harass. So once the Terran has combat shields and stim, you're going to have to switch up your unit counter. So one that's obviously very popular is the Colossi, or Colossus, the Colossus. And we'll add on some Marines, and as you can see, even with no units to soak up damage, the Colossus just melts through Marines very quickly. And with Zealots in front and extended thermal lances, it's really no contest for the Colossus. The High Templar is good as well. And assume that we have Psionic Storm unlocked. And then when you're done with the initial storms, you can always make an Archon. Archon's great versus bio units. And the Sentry is an interesting unit. It works really well, but not by itself. So you'll use the Sentry with, say, Zealots. And the Zealots will soak up damage for the Sentry, and the Sentry will provide Guardian Shield. And Guardian Shield really reduces Zealot damage, and you can also make this little wall in to prevent the enemy from running out while your Zealots do the damage they need to. So Sentry works. Sentry helps with the Archon too. Archons are really good against Marines, as you'll see. Even when the supplies really favor the Marine, the Archons do pretty well. So obviously this is a way favoring the Marine, so not the best example. Close. This is an even supply battle. The problem is that with a good Terran, it's going to be able to kite these Archons a little bit better. See, Sentries are very helpful. They do reduce the damage that you'll take, and they can block the enemy Marines in place. So the other two counters I want to discuss are the Tempest and the Carrier. Both do pretty well against Marines. And the reason is that they both have a native armor of 2, whereas Marines only have... The problem with Marines is that they only do 6 damage, so when the native armor is 2, they barely deal damage, with there's so much health on both of these units. So, something good to know. Massive air units, good versus Marines. So that's it for Protoss. As you can see, there's tons of options available. The trick really to stopping Marines is just protecting your High Templar from Ghosts, your Colossi from Vikings, your Archons from Ghosts, or getting up to top air units. And so we're talking about Terran counters to the Marine. One of the early game ones, a Reaper does do well against Marine. That is something to know. That's why Reaper openers are very popular with Terrans. You know, we're going to assume no stim pack or anything. That was obviously mismicroed since I'm talking. But you can pick off, you know, you can do your damage to the enemy's unit and then just run and recover. And Terran players have had a lot of success with just messing with enemy Marines, and once they keep thinning out the Marine count, there's not really a lot the Terran can do. If they have to build a bunker or get up to a Marauder or a Hellion to stop the Reaper harass. And, reinforcing Reapers can make that more dangerous. But that's not the real counter to the Marine. The real reason that Marines are just not popular in late game TVT or mid game TVT is once siege tanks come out, it's pretty much over for the Marine. Oops. So if we had 5 tanks versus 15 Marines in equal supply, and even if we gave those Marines the upgrades they needed, even if we split them up a little bit, they're just not going to do very well. Yeah, they might kill a tank at best. So siege tanks are really what stops Marines. So other counters that work decently, the Hellion is pretty good. If we're gonna assume you have Infernal Pre-Igniter, if they're gonna have stim and combat shields. And some micro is required to use the Hellion successfully. So if you just stand there, you won't do very well, as you can see. Okay, so Hellion works, and the last counter that's actually probably the strongest of them all is the Battlecruiser. Even in equal supplies, the Marine just doesn't do well versus the Battlecruiser. Battlecruiser's got too much health and too much armor. Just barely takes damage against the Marines. The Amada Cannon's also really nice for taking out medevacs. It barely changes anything if there's a bunch of medevacs present. So, the last one I want to discuss is the Thor. Thor does pretty well against Marines too, just because it can one-shot them. So, at first it might look like the Marines are going to do well, but they really quickly lose their steam once the Thor takes out a couple. So, pretty strong counter. Mech counters Bio. Usually Terran players that use Bio, they use medevacs to try to attack and harass the enemy Terran rather than using it to attack the mech forces straight up. So, let's talk about the Zerg. So Zerg against Marines, they always have problems with them. One good strategy that's come somewhat popular lately is just mass Hydralisks, or even backed up by Roaches, and that works okay, but only if you have an economic advantage. Just mass Marine with medevac support will actually kind of trade with this, or actually slightly beat this, Roach and Hydra. But Zerg often usually have a base advantage over Terrans. So if you do have a base advantage, you can make this work, especially with decent Viper or Infestor play for backup. Vipers can use Blinding Cloud, Fungal Growth from the Infestor. Both can help decently against Marines. Banelings are kind of a counter to the Marine. But you have to be really careful, because an equal supply Baneling army to a Marine army, it costs 3 times, it's literally 3 times the cost. So, this is an equal supply army, but it's certainly not an equal cost army. And even though you killed all those with plenty left, you still lost a ton of units to do so, and that's just a direct hit. So careful not to overload on the Banelings unless, again, you have a supply advantage. You can't trade evenly with bio units using lots of Banelings. You need Zerglings and Mutas, you need to attack indirectly, you need to use, good strategy. So the other thing with the Baneling is it's much easier to hit the opponent if, 1, you have a lot of Zerglings as assistance, and 2, if you have Baneling speed, and 3, if you are on creep. The creep will give you a speed bonus, and centrifugal hooks will give you a speed bonus. Makes it much harder for Marines to kite your Baneling. So always try to engage on creep, always get centrifugal hooks right away. And the upgrade I'm talking about here is this. It's at the Baneling nest. It does require a layer though. So if you're looking for straight up hard counters to the Marine, the Ultralisk is one. And it works very well against the Marine, even if the Marine is in large quantities. And with chitinous plating in particular, or chitinous plating, the Ultralisks become much stronger, so keep that in mind. So Ultralisks are good, Broodlords are very good as well. Be careful with them though, you don't want to expose them over the ground like this. You want to have ground units in between these two, because if you don't, and the Terran player focus fires, they will do decently against your units. And Broodlords are much more expensive than Marines. So you want to try to engage the enemy with your Broodlords in such a way that they can't get underneath them to get in range. So over like open space like this, or use Zerglings to block them in, prevent them from getting too close, stutter stepping to an extent, those all work. So the last thing we're going to talk about is the Infestor. And if we had, so say, a standard force of a bunch of Zerglings versus a bunch of Marines, but we also had an Infestor in the mix, you can see that with Fungal Growth, you can really do a lot of damage. It does a lot of damage and it keeps everything locked in place. So without the Infestor in that scenario, it's not even a close fight, with no Zergling speed and no upgrades. It's pretty heavily favors the Marines. So it just gives you an example of the strength of the Infestor. The Infestor isn't used as much because it's hard to land its attack. You now have to aim it. So it's very easy for units to miss like that. So that's it for this video. You know now how to counter with everything. And the only other thing I want to discuss again is the Baneling. It's so expensive. It does counter the Marine, but just be careful with it. So let's say the enemy's got a big army of Marines, and you've got a big army of Zerglings and Banelings. This army does well, but it is expensive. So just keep that in mind. So even though I won and have a supply lead here, I actually spent more money to attack. And that's, of course, I'm trying to control 2 units at once, so it's not super smooth. But you get the idea. That Banelings can quickly become more expensive than they're worth. They are a Marine counter, though. So that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful for you, and good luck in countering the Marine in your matches of StarCraft 2.